a lot of ways to mobilize the hip and start actively and dynamically stretching that anterior hip flexor quadricep mechanism. But also, if you have a tight anterior capsule, which is not always the case, that's another area that you're going to have to look at lengthening. Dave Schmitz, ResistanceBandTraining.com, coming to you with a little bit of a unique way to mobilize the anterior hip using the band and placing it distal versus proximal, which is what we usually do. You know, you've seen me place the band at my hip, at my waist, and generate some active dynamic stretching of the hip flexor quad. Well, what I'm doing here is I'm actually going ahead and placing it below the hip joint. And why I'm doing that is to create a little bit of femoral extension or femoral posterior glide while I'm creating a good glute activation. And what I find is sometimes that's a better way to get the anterior hip to start mobilizing and lengthening out. So what I'm doing here right now is the band is holding me here. It's pulling my femur posterior, okay? And I am keeping a good lower abdominal activation with a good hip activation. Now I think what really happens with this setup is the band activates my glutes more aggressively because of where it's attached. So I've got to create a little bit longer lever arm. Now if I move it down further here, I don't get the same effect anymore. So it's got to be proximal. It's got to be put right up into that anterior hip crease. And then what I'm doing is just actively contracting against the band by actively contracting my glutes. If you want to add the arm in to create another counter force from the top down, that's fine to go ahead and do. Just make sure rib cage stays flat. We don't get that big arch. Maybe even get a little bit of a posterior glide or a posterior pelvic tilt to activate the glutes even more. All right, but the key thing is we're trying to mobilize that hip flexor, quadricep first, anterior capsule maybe, but again, very often the anterior capsule has already been lengthened too much because the hip flexor quads were not lengthened appropriately, and we talk, it's very difficult to do that. So make sure when you're doing this, little posterior tilt, and then keep those lower abdominals activated and get that glute activated and just start opening up that hip. If you want to add a little rotation with it, you can add a little rotation with it to increase it. You can go ahead and add a little side gliding with it to again after that hip. Very nice way to mobilize that anterior hip flexor quadricep complex.